The girl by the saloon door did not shiver, though the evening air was losing its warmth fast. She stood with her back to the wall, skirts tattered just above the ankle, hair unbrushed but thick and dark, the kind that might have once been braided with ribbons or pinned in church. Now, it tangled in the wind like prairie grass left too long. Her name was Delaney Rhodes, though no one had spoken it kindly in months. She didn't beg. That was important. Folks might toss coins at a child or a one-legged war veteran, but not at a girl with shadows around her eyes and a past no one wanted to acknowledge. So she simply waited, eyes low, hands folded around a dented tin cup, not held out, just resting against her stomach like she'd forgotten it was there. The saloon behind her pulsed with laughter and fiddle music, boot heels clacking against wooden floors. Every time the door swung open, golden light spilled across her face, revealing cheeks hollowed by skipped meals and a jaw set with quiet defiance. Men passed her with flushed cheeks and loose tongues. One snorted, "Ain't that the preacher's girl? Or what's left of her?" Delaney didn't flinch. It was nearly dark when he came, tall, with a limp in his left leg that slowed but didn't hinder him. He wore a weathered hat low over his brow and carried himself like someone who had learned to need little and ask for even less. His name was Cade Mercer, and in Willow Ridge, he was a man who rarely spoke more than 10 words a day. The cattle respected him. The bartender nodded to him. The rest of the town kept their distance, not out of fear, but because solitude clung to him like a second skin. He stepped onto the boardwalk, carrying a half-finished plate of beans and cornbread. As he passed her, Delaney's voice barely rose above the wind. "May I have your leftovers, mister?" He stopped. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was wide. It pulled the attention of the men smoking cigars nearby and the woman swatting flies off a pie inside the window. Cade turned slowly. His eyes, pale as winter skies, met hers. She didn't smile, didn't plead. She just looked up with that same expression she wore like armor, tired, quiet, waiting for the worst. He didn't hand her the plate. Instead, he walked to the empty table near the edge of the porch and sat. The chair across from him scraped softly as he nudged it out with his boot. "It's warm still," he said, not quite looking at her. She stared at the plate, at him, at the chair. Then, after a long moment, she tucked the tin cup behind her back, stepped forward, and sat. The porch fell into a hush, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the shuffle of boots pretending not to watch. Cade picked up his fork, pushed the plate halfway across the table, and kept eating. After a second's pause, Delaney did the same. She chewed slowly, like the food was unfamiliar. He noticed the way she straightened her back just slightly when the laughter inside rose, how she kept her chin level, no matter the weight of judgment pressing down from every porch beam and window pane. "Name's Cade," he said, after they'd finished the plate. "Delaney," she answered. He nodded, tipped his hat, and rose. She stood too, brushing crumbs from her lap with the edge of her sleeve. "Thank you." He reached into his coat pocket and laid a square of folded cloth, clean, checked flannel, on the table where her hands had rested. Then he walked away, his limp more pronounced in the low light. Delaney picked up the cloth slowly, like it might vanish. She tucked it into her dress pocket and didn't look back toward the saloon. By morning, the story had spread like spilled whiskey. Cade Mercer shared supper with that girl. Some said he was drunk. Others figured he'd taken pity, maybe guilt from the war or some long-dead wife. But no one guessed the truth. He saw something in her eyes that didn't ask for saving, just for space to breathe. Delaney went to the church steps before sunrise. She washed her face at the pump and used a comb she'd traded a button for the week before. She stitched a small tear in her sleeve. If Cade came back that evening, and she didn't assume he would, she wanted to look less like a ghost. That afternoon, she swept the front steps of the Mercantile. The owner didn't pay her, but didn't stop her either. Dust flew, and her arms ached, but she stood straighter when people passed. She earned nothing for it, except, perhaps, not being chased away. Cade returned just as the sun dipped low. He walked past her without a word, boots thudding on the planks, but at the table near the porch edge, there were 2 tin cups. One full of coffee, steaming gently. Delaney hesitated before approaching. He didn't look up, didn't gesture, but didn't move the second cup either. She sat. "Hard day?" he asked, sipping. She nodded. Broom was too short. That almost earned a smile. They didn't talk more than 10 words between them, but silence with Cade didn't feel like absence. It felt like room to exist. Inside the saloon, someone whispered too loudly, "He's feeding her again." Delaney didn't flinch this time. She sipped the coffee slowly and wrapped her hands around the cup like it was a fire. "I can help with your chores," she said after a while. "I'm not just hungry. I can work." He didn't answer right away. Then, "You ever handle livestock?" "No. But I learned fast." He stood. "Come by the barn at dawn. Bring gloves if you got any." She didn't. But she'd find some. That night, Delaney lay on a wool blanket in the church's shed, moonlight spilling through the slats. She clutched the checked cloth square to her chest. Not because it smelled like him, it didn't. It smelled like dust and lye soap. But it was the first clean thing someone had offered her in weeks. And he'd left it without pride or pity. In the quiet, she remembered her father's sermons about dignity. He used to say that mercy wasn't in grand gestures, but in everyday choices, a man handing his coat, a woman sharing bread. But he hadn't shown her mercy when she needed it most. He'd slammed the door harder than any stranger ever could. She breathed in slow. The barn. Gloves. Livestock. She didn't know the first thing about cows or horses, but she'd learn. She'd watch. She wouldn't ask for leftovers again. In the next town over, they might call her ruined. Here, maybe they would just call her Delaney. And maybe, just maybe, Cade would keep drinking coffee beside her. She didn't dream. Her sleep was hard and deep, the kind that comes when your belly's full and your heart isn't entirely empty. Dawn was still a rumor on the horizon when she rose. She borrowed gloves from the old woman who ran the boarding house kitchen, swept the alley behind it in trade. When she reached Cade's barn, he was already there, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and a second cup of coffee waiting on a fence post. He handed it to her wordlessly, and this time she smiled. Just barely. They didn't talk about her past. Didn't speak of the preacher or the whispers or the ways the town still looked through her like glass. But when she reached for the broom and he let her clean out the stalls beside him, it felt like something had begun. Not forgiveness, not love, just a beginning. And sometimes a beginning was the bravest thing a ruined girl could ask for. Sometimes it started with leftovers. Sometimes with a cup. And sometimes with a cowboy who simply looked and didn't look away. By the third morning, Delaney no longer waited behind fences for permission. She showed up just before the frost lifted, wearing borrowed gloves and a braid she'd made from combing out her hair in a tin mirror behind the church. Cade was already at the barn, elbow deep in hay, his coat collar turned against the cold. He didn't greet her. Didn't need to. He passed her the pitchfork and nodded toward the far stall. And she understood. That meant she was expected now. The work was quiet. It wasn't glamorous, shoveling manure, hauling water, calming jittery horses that twitched at morning light, but it was clean, in a way. No one spat near her boots out here. No one asked what she used to be, or what man she'd failed to tether. There was just the sound of leather creaking, hooves shifting, and Cade's low voice when he showed her how to loop a halter or check a hoof. Some days he said nothing at all, and that, strangely, was enough. The town noticed. Of course they did. Delaney caught it in the way people stared a beat too long when she passed. How whispers rose like nettles at her back whenever she entered the mercantile. She felt the shift, as if her presence disturbed something the town had settled long ago, the comfort of casting someone out and never expecting to see them stand again. By the week's end, the whispers had names. Cade Mercer's feeding her more than coffee, I reckon. Poor man's got a soft spot for strays. She'll drag his name down like she did her daddy's. Delaney heard it all, but she'd learned that shame didn't kill you. It just made you quieter, sharper, slower to trust. It made you measure every kindness twice before accepting it. So she kept working. In the evenings, Kate poured 2 cups of coffee, always black, always hot, and they'd sit on the porch while the sun folded itself behind the hills. Sometimes he'd ask how her hands were holding up, Other times they just listened to the frogs start their song. One evening, after a long day of fence mending and colt taming, she brought him something wrapped in calico cloth. He raised an eyebrow as she placed it in his hands, a shirt. The stitching was uneven, the collar a little crooked, but it was clean and made with intention. "You've been tearing your old one near the shoulders," she said softly. "Figured I could try." He unfolded it slowly, thumb brushing over a rough seam. "Looks better than any I've had in years," he said. "Thank you." He didn't say more, but he wore it the next day. Didn't mention it. Just buttoned it up like it had always belonged to him. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something gentler. Respect, maybe. Gratitude with a deeper root. Still, kindness doesn't go unnoticed in a town like Willow Ridge. Not when it's aimed at the wrong person. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Abelman, stopped Delaney outside the grocer's one afternoon, her hands folded like claws around a hymnal. She smiled, thin and bitter. "You're working now, I hear. With Mr. Mercer." Delaney didn't answer. "Does he know your history, dear? It's easy for men to mistake a pretty face for a clean soul." Delaney didn't drop her eyes. "I don't mistake you for kind just because you wear white gloves, ma'am." It wasn't meant to be brave, just honest, but it carried through the air like a slap. By the next morning, half the town seemed to be whispering that Delaney Rhodes had sass now, and wasn't that just proof she'd never changed? Cade didn't mention the gossip. If he'd heard it, he didn't let it show. But he started walking with her to the pump after chores, saying little, just ensuring she made it back to the church steps safely. A few men watched them pass and muttered beneath their breath. One spit in the dirt behind them. Kay didn't flinch, just kept walking. She noticed how his shoulders tightened more these days, how his limp seemed worse when the sky hung heavy with storm. "You don't have to keep walking me home," she said once, brushing wind from her cheek. "I've made it through worse alone." "I know," he said, "but you shouldn't have to." That was all, but it settled into her chest like a warm coal. Still, the town wouldn't let up. Mrs. Abelman whispered to the sheriff about preserving decency. A woman from the quilting circle crossed the street when Delaney walked by. The store clerk gave her the wrong change with a smirk, and when she pointed it out, he said, "Funny how folks who take handouts get mighty particular." That night, she didn't go to the barn. She sat instead on the cold church steps, knees pulled to her chest, watching the wind sweep through brittle grass. She wondered if Cade noticed, if he'd even missed her at all. She told herself she didn't care. The next morning, a knock came on the old church door before dawn. She cracked it open and found a bundle on the stoop, 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, still warm, and a small note in blocky handwriting. "Some days aren't worth answering back. Let him talk. Fence needs patching when you're ready." Her fingers trembled around the paper. She ate one of the biscuits slow, letting the butter and molasses melt on her tongue. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a ghost. She returned to the barn that afternoon. He didn't ask where she'd been. She didn't explain. They worked quietly, and at the end of the day, as the sun bruised the horizon, she poured the coffee this time. 2 cups, black as always, no sugar. "Do you think they'll ever stop?" she asked after a long silence. He didn't pretend not to understand. "No," he said, "but eventually they'll get tired. And if they don't, then we keep doing what we're doing. They can't hang a man for sitting beside someone decent." Decent. That word. It cracked something open in her chest. She stared into her cup, letting the heat fog her lashes. "You're not scared they'll stop coming to your ranch? Stop trading with you? They might. And that's worth it?" He didn't answer at first. Just looked out over the fence line. "Most things I've lost weren't worth keeping." She turned that over in her mind. Let it settle. "I don't know if I'm decent," she whispered. "I think I was once. But I've done things I'd take back if I could." "Me too," he said. The wind moved through the grass. A hawk circled above the ridge. Somewhere behind them, laughter rose from the saloon, but it didn't feel near. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the napkin he'd once given her, still folded, still clean. She laid it on the railing between them. "Seems fair to return it," she said. "You're not the only one who can offer something." He looked at the cloth, then at her. "I reckon I gave it as a gift," he said. best to keep it. She smiled, small but real. The kind of smile that grows from a seed buried deep. That evening, as she walked back to the church, she passed the store again. The clerk glanced up. For a second, he didn't sneer. She didn't smile at him. She didn't need to. She had coffee waiting on the porch of a man who saw her. And tomorrow, there would be fences to mend. And maybe, just maybe, a little more to build between them. The bell tolled 3 times before the townsfolk began to shuffle toward the white clapboard church, boots crunching over gravel, parasols tilting against the early sun. It was the first clear Sunday in weeks. Rain had softened the road ruts, and the air smelled of clean dirt and lilacs blooming wild along the fences. But no one seemed to notice the beauty of the day. They were too busy glancing sideways as Delaney Rhodes stepped up the path. She didn't walk beside Cade Mercer. She walked alone, 3 paces behind him, her face unreadable beneath a faded sunbonnet. The fabric was clean but worn thin at the brim, and her dress, newer now, sewn from traded calico and steadied by invisible mending, hung just right. Not proud, not pitiful, just enough to say, "I am still here." The preacher paused mid-sentence when he saw her enter. He blinked once, then cleared his throat and resumed reading from Luke as if nothing had changed. But something had. Delaney didn't take the back pew this time. She slipped into the 3rd row on the far right near the aisle, where a man's broad-shouldered shadow already marked the space beside her. Cade didn't look at her. He sat with his arms resting loosely on his knees, hat in hand, eyes focused on the cross behind the pulpit. But his presence beside her was a kind of shield. Unspoken, steady. A child dropped a hymnal behind them. Delaney turned and handed it back to him, her hands gentle. The boy's mother grabbed his wrist and yanked him closer with a hissed whisper. Delaney faced forward again, the ghost of a sigh lost in the rustle of turning pages. The sermon passed without mention of sin or shame, but the subtext sat heavy in the room. The preacher's wife stiffened every time Delaney moved. A woman near the front fanned herself fast enough to stir her neighbor's air. And when the final hymn began, only half the voices rose. The rest sang with their mouths closed, waiting for her to leave. Outside, Cade waited at the bottom of the steps, hat tilted low, watching the street more than the people. Delaney descended slowly, aware of every eye, every word waiting just behind teeth. She didn't falter. "Thank you," she murmured as she passed him. "Don't thank me for standing where I'm meant to be," he said. They walked to the edge of town before speaking again. Willow trees trembled in the breeze, and cattle lowed faintly in the fields. It could have been a peaceful moment, but the air between them was heavy. "They won't stop," she said. "Not after today. No, they think I shamed you. They think a lot of things." She stopped walking, turned to him. "Do you?" Cade met her gaze, then really met it. Not just her eyes, but everything behind them. The long nights, the silence, the way she never asked for more than she was given, but always gave something back. Her question hung in the air like a thrown stone. "I think you've held yourself together longer than most men I've known," he said. "That's not shame. That's strength." Her throat tightened. She nodded, barely, then kept walking. Back at the ranch, the sheep were restless. It was lambing season, and Cade's bad legs slowed him more than usual. Delaney moved beside him with quiet competence now, no longer a guest in his barn, but part of its rhythm. One lamb refused to nurse. Its mother had turned her face away, disinterested or overwhelmed. Delaney scooped the trembling body into her arms and settled in the straw, cradling it like she'd once done for something smaller, softer. She hummed, just under her breath. Cade paused, the sound unfamiliar and arresting. "What is that?" he asked. "Just a lullaby. My mama used to sing it." "You sing like someone who misses someone." "I do." The lamb's breathing slowed. It nuzzled her collarbone, seeking warmth. "Did you name it?" he asked. She shook her head. "You should." She hesitated, then whispered, "Mercy." He said nothing, but his eyes lingered longer than usual. That night, over coffee and the last of the cornbread, Delaney told him about the baby. Not the whole story at first, just the edges. The traveling man with promises. The letters that stopped coming. The way her father's fury eclipsed any grief he might have shown. The silence that followed the child's first cry, and the way its second never came. "I buried her behind the elder bush," she said, voice flat but not cold. No one came. Cade's jaw flexed. He didn't look at her, just stared into the dark. "I left town after Martha died," he said after a long pause. "Didn't see the point of staying. Figured I'd take my chances with the wolves." "What brought you back?" The wind turned. She almost laughed. Instead, she leaned back and let the night hold them both. The next morning, the sheriff came by. He didn't tip his hat. Just stood at the fence, lips tight, eyes scanning both of them like a man sent to deliver a message he didn't agree with. "There's been talk," he said. "A petition from the preacher's wife and a few others. They want Miss Rhodes to leave town." Delaney didn't speak. Cade did. "On what grounds?" "They say she's making a mockery of good order. That children are watching. That women feel threatened." Cade stepped forward. "Let me make something clear," he said quietly. "She's here because I asked her to be. She works harder than most men I've hired. If you let them drive her out, I go with her. And you'll lose trade, help, and decency." The sheriff studied him for a long time, then turned and walked back down the road without another word. Delaney waited until he disappeared over the rise. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. I don't want to cost you your home." "You are my home." The words weren't romantic. Not yet. Just true. She breathed in, let the silence wrap around them. Later that week, they walked into the general store together. The storekeeper eyed them with his usual smirk, rang up their order, and handed back the change with too much noise. When Delaney reached for the bag, he muttered, "Hope the good people of Willowridge appreciate you two setting such a fine example." She froze. Cade reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the exact change, and set it on the counter. "Keep your coin," he said. "We'll get what we need somewhere else." They walked out in silence, but her shoulders were straighter than they'd been in months. That evening, she made stew, real stew, with beef and potatoes and a pinch of salt she'd bartered for. Cade sat by the fire, boots off, hands warm around a chipped mug. "You don't have to keep fighting," she said, placing a bowl beside him. He looked up. "You do." She sat beside him. "Do you ever wish things were simpler?" she asked. "They're only simple when you stop caring." She thought about that. Nodded slowly. "I think I'm tired of being forgotten." He reached over, fingers brushing hers. "Then don't be." She held his hand. Just for a moment. And in that moment, the world didn't hate them. The wind didn't whisper lies. The fire crackled soft and steady, and her name, Delaney, felt like something worth saying out loud again. It began with smoke curling from the church steeple. At first, no one noticed. The town was mid-sermon, the new preacher droning through psalms as sun streamed through cracked glass. The pews were stiff with summer sweat, and most eyes drooped beneath fans and parasols. But Delaney, seated beside Cade near the back, lifted her head. Her nose twitched once, then again. Her body stiffened. Something in the air, sharp, earthy, wrong. She turned toward the windows just as the first shimmer of black curled skyward. "Smoke," she whispered, then louder. "Smoke." The room erupted. Fans dropped, Bibles hit the floor. People surged toward the doors, pushing past each other with sudden desperation. The preacher called for calm, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of feet and fear. Outside, the church roof had begun to burn, flames licking upward like fingers seeking heaven. The dry timber caught fast. Someone screamed. A child cried. A woman fainted. Cade turned to her. "Go," he said, already limping forward into the chaos. "There's still people inside," Delaney said, breath hitching. "The Sunday school, behind the altar." They moved together without another word. Smoke met them like a beast, thick and choking, biting at their lungs. The heat rolled in waves, sweat beading instantly along their skin. Cade used his coat to shield his face, but Delaney ducked low, skirts gathered, breath short. She knew this building, knew every stair, every turn. She had scrubbed its steps, polished its pews. It was no longer a house of judgment. It was simply a place that needed saving. Behind the altar, the door to the rear room was blocked by a fallen beam. She could hear coughing beyond it, soft, wet, small. "A child," she gasped. "I'll lift," Cade growled, bracing himself. Pulled him out. The wood was burning hot, and it cracked as he heaved. Delaney slipped through the gap, choking, eyes stinging. Inside, a boy no older than 7 curled in a corner, eyes wide with terror. She reached him, pulled him close. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're getting you out." He clung to her, trembling. Outside, Cade's strength faltered, but he held. She crawled forward, the child tight in her arms, and pushed him through first. "Take him." Cade caught the boy, stumbled back. "Delaney now." She turned, and the ceiling groaned. She moved, and the roof gave. The beam missed her by inches, crashing behind as she lunged forward. Cade grabbed her hand, yanking her into the clear. They stumbled down the steps, into daylight and dirt and gasping breath. Behind them, the church moaned once more and collapsed in a shower of sparks and timber. Someone cheered. Others stared. The boy sobbed in Cade's arms, then reached for Delaney. "She saved me," he wept. She came back. The mother arrived then, tears streaking her cheeks. She fell to her knees and held her son. Delaney staggered to her feet, blackened and shaking, dress scorched to the hem. She looked around at the people, faces stunned, silent. No one spoke. Not yet. But something had shifted. The next day, they brought soup, a loaf of bread, 2 jars of preserves, left on the porch without notes, but with intention. Cade found them first, carried them inside without a word. Delaney stared at the food for a long time, unsure what to make of it. "Maybe they're sorry," she said finally. "Maybe they're beginning to understand," Cade replied. The burn on her arm blistered by evening. Cade wrapped it carefully, his fingers gentle, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak of the fire. He didn't ask why she'd gone back in. But something in the way he looked at her changed, deepened, steadied. He offered her the ledger the next morning. "I've been thinking," he said, laying it on the table beside her coffee. "If I'm gone a week driving cattle, someone's got to know the books. You've earned that right." She didn't answer at first, just traced the spine of the ledger with a fingertip. "I've never been trusted with anything that mattered," she said. "You matter," he said simply. That night, she stood on the porch while the sky bruised to purple. The air was soft. The land breathed slowly. Cade stepped out beside her, coffee in hand. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. "I haven't thought of much else." He turned to her then, fully, deliberately. His eyes were calm, but intense. "I don't mean as a helper. I mean as someone beside me. As family." The word floated between them, light and terrifying. "I'm not clean," she said. "Not the way this town wants. My name's still stained in most mouths." "Then let them choke on it." She laughed, short and soft. "I'd be a scandal. You already are." She looked at him then. Really looked. The man who had given her his coffee without conditions. Who had never asked her to confess or atone. Who had stood beside her without demand. Who had seen the worth in her before she saw it in herself. "All right," she said, "but I won't be a secret." "You'll be everything," he said, openly. They stood in silence a while longer. A week passed. The town began to nod at her instead of turning away. Small things changed, an extra biscuit on a plate, a cleaner smile, the soft tilt of a hat as she passed. Then came the preacher's wife. She arrived mid-morning, her hands twisted around her purse strap like a noose. Delaney opened the door, expecting barbs. "I was wrong," the woman said, voice clipped but clear. "You saved my grandson. That deserves acknowledgement." Delaney didn't smile. She didn't gloat. "Thank you," she said simply. The woman left with her dignity intact. Delaney watched her go and exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Cade came in from the barn that evening with something tucked beneath his arm. A package wrapped in oilskin. "Found this in the loft. Been meaning to fix it up." He handed it to her. She unwrapped it slowly. A dress. Not new but fine. Deep blue. Fitted in the shoulders. Meant for a woman not afraid to be seen. "Figured it might suit you for Sunday." She touched the fabric with reverence. "Is this a proposal?" she asked, tone light. "No," he said. "That comes with a ring. This is just me saying, wear something you like. You don't need to disappear anymore." Sunday came. Delaney walked to church with Kate at her side, wearing the blue dress and no bonnet. Her hair was pinned up, proud. She didn't hide. They took their place in the third row again. This time, no one flinched. After the benediction, the preacher spoke her name. "Delaney Rhodes," he said, eye steady. "Your courage last week was seen. Your kindness is remembered. Thank you." It was an absolution, but it was recognition. And sometimes that was enough. She held Cade's hand as they walked out, and he didn't let go. Later that evening, they sat on the porch watching lightning crawl across distant hills. The air smelled like sage and new rain. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You ever wonder why you saw me that first night?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I think God sends us signs," he said at last. "Some folks look for thunder. I got you, asking for my leftovers." She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I wanted food," she said. "But you gave me something more." "You gave it to yourself," he said. "I just didn't look away." The rain started soft, tapping the porch roof. They stayed outside anyway, hand in hand, warm despite the storm. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives quietly, on a plate, in a glance, beneath a sunbonnet or a stitched shirt. Sometimes it is built in the shadow of shame, rising slow, sturdy, like a fence mended rail by rail. And when it's real, it doesn't ask who you were. It only holds you close and says, "Stay." Because even a girl the world tried to erase can eat with grace, and be remembered not for what she lacked, but for what she gave. And in the hush of twilight, with the smell of coffee and rain in the air, Cade Mercer turned to Delaney Rhodes, the girl who once asked for scraps, and said, without fanfare, without fear, "You're mine if you want to be." She didn't answer with words. She just leaned in and kissed him like she'd earned it, because she had. If this story moved you, please let me know. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear that, and also like, comment, and subscribe.